A few years ago, I embarked on making my own chef's knives, and now I only use my own knives when I'm cooking professionally. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why and how I've made my own knives, and hopefully if it's something you're interested in, this can be a start point for you to learn more. This will be an introduction and an overview to the process of making your own knives, not an in-depth instructional video. Whilst I have made a number of my own knives and they're what I use all the time cooking professionally in the kitchen, I'm not a bladesmith and I don't consider myself to be an expert on the process. So I'll be talking about how and why I've done this, sharing some of what I've learned, what I think is really valuable about it, and a bit of an overview of the process. But there is elsewhere that you can look to find really detailed expert instruction on exactly how to go about it. I first became interested in the idea of making my own knives when I read a blog post by Alan Hamburger about 5 years ago. He's a fascinating guy who's been involved in loads of really interesting creative projects and produced two of the most beautiful cookbooks that I've ever seen, and I will link to his original blog post below. There's basically two approaches that you can take to making your own chef's knives. You could start completely from scratch, making your own blade, doing the metalworking and then building that blade up into a finished knife, or you can buy blade blanks, which are high quality ready-made blades which you're then going to build a handle for, build up into a knife which is unique to you but doesn't require the metalworking. Let's start off though by talking about why you might want to make your own knives, what are some of the benefits and why I think it's valuable and interesting. As a chef, I think that anything that deepens our engagement with our ingredients or our tools can be really valuable and help to make you a better and more conscious cook. And I'd use the example of something like foraging or growing your own ingredients as a way in which you can have more of a connection with those, a better understanding of the process that goes into them and their value before they even arrive into your kitchen. And then when you have that, you're going to be so much more careful with the way that you treat those things, and their value is going to feel so much more personal to you. And I think you can extend that idea out to your tools. If you've either made a tool that you're using yourself, or even if you just have an understanding of the level of craftsmanship that goes into it, you're going to be so careful with how you treat and look after that tool, and when you use it, you're going to feel more professional, more engaged, and it's going to help you to pay more attention and care overall to everything that you're doing. I love what I do and I want to be immersed in it, and whilst I know that primarily my skills and creativity are always going to be in the kitchen and I'll never be a great knife maker or photographer, I do think that I'm a better cook for having dabbled in those things and for some of the cross-pollination that happens between different disciplines. I'm really proud of the knives that I've made, and they have a lot of psychological value to me on a couple of levels. On the one hand, when I pick one up to work with, it has a similar effect to putting my chef's jacket on. It helps me feel set in my role and what I'm focused on. I know it's time to do my best work. But also on a more emotional level, I have a lot of emotional attachment to them. I spent a lot of time working on them. They all feel like they have slightly different personalities to me, if that doesn't sound too mad. And a few of them I worked on in specific different places in the world. I took a couple of them traveling around France with me when me and my partner went driving around France for a summer, and worked on them, just hand finishing them in different places, so they feel very connected to those specific places for me. And then lastly, there's the physical sense of connection to the knives. Having made them myself, I was able to make the handles so that they perfectly fit my grip, which is really useful and also makes them really comfortable to use. So I mentioned before that there are two ways you could approach making your own knives. You could do the metalwork and make the blade from scratch and use that as your start point, or you can buy a blade blank and then build that up into a knife. Now, the knives that I use every day in my kitchen, I bought really high quality, expensive Japanese blade blanks and then built them up into knives. And the reason for that is I'm a professional chef and I need my knives to be really high quality. They're tools that I'm using to do professional work all the time. But I have done both, and I'll talk to you a little bit about both of them now. So we'll start off by talking about how you would make a blade if that's what you want to pursue. I have a very small gas-powered forge which I've used to do a little bit of metalwork, but realistically it is hard to make a good quality blade if you don't have access to the right materials. However, there are places that you can go and do courses and use the equipment if you want to make a blade from scratch. I did a bladesmithing day in Bristol which I really enjoyed. We started the day with a blank piece of metal, and over the course of the day, using the forge, we shaped that into a knife. We got the experience of starting with our blank piece of metal, working the blade and going through the process of shaping and heat treating. I found it really insightful, especially as someone who had a little experience of working with knives but only via using blade blanks. Seeing the level of craftsmanship, how technically and physically challenging it is, and the level of artisan skill that goes into making a tool like this was really fascinating. I would absolutely highly recommend it to anyone that's interested in learning about making their own knives. It's certainly something that I know I would love to do again, and something I'd really love to learn a lot more about and maybe one day master even just the basics of. The great thing about doing a day like this as well is that you come away at the end of the day with a beautiful knife that you've made yourself in a way that would be really difficult on your own without the specialist equipment and the expert instruction. It's challenging to make a really high quality knife using a blade that you've made yourself from scratch if you're doing it as a one-off, but you can make a really high quality knife using a blade blank. So with blades, much like with knives themselves, you really get what you pay for. So if you want to make a really high-end knife, you should be prepared to spend a couple of £100 on a really high-end Japanese blade. But equally, if you just want to do it as a bit of an experiment and as a fun project, you can do it much cheaper than this. I'll leave a couple of links to places that you can get blade blanks in the description, but for something really good, you should be prepared to search around a little bit. And my personal preference for blades and my experience was that looking for something handmade from Japan is really the best way to go. If you do decide that you're going to go the route of getting a blade blank and building up a knife from that, then there's a couple of different choices when it comes to materials and handle style. You might decide that for say more day-to-day use you want to go for something made from stainless steel. It's very easy to care for, or you might prefer to go for a more traditional Japanese blue steel, which sharpens up beautifully but does require a bit more care, and you have to be really careful not to leave those wet. Then when it comes to handles, you're broadly either looking at Western or Japanese style handles. Now you could go into loads more detail on this, and people much more expert than me could go into a lot more detail I'm sure, but I'll cover this just very briefly. Western knives tend to have metal that runs all the way through the handle, whereas Japanese knives tend to have a shorter section of metal that you insert into your wooden handle. When it comes to making your own handles, it will depend on the style of blade blank that you went for, but in terms of woodwork, I think it's slightly easier to start with the Japanese style handles. Lastly, you can choose the material you want to use for your handles. My preference is to use stabilised wood, which you can make yourself or you can buy, and I quite like filling in any gaps in the wood using coloured epoxy resin. It gives a really nice effect, and again that's something you can do yourself if you have a vacuum machine, or you can buy. But there's also options for other materials, both man-made and natural. So if this is something you want to give a try, you can either get yourself booked in on a bladesmithing day, or find yourself a nice blade blank and some handle material, and then there are videos that will show you how you can go about making a handle for it. I hope you found this interesting. I know it's a bit more of an overview rather than in-depth and instructional, but with any look it gives you a sense of whether or not this is something you'd like to try, and if it is, you can find those more in-depth instructional videos elsewhere on YouTube. If you've enjoyed the video, please give me a like and hit subscribe, and if you'd like to see more from me, you can find me over on Patreon, where there's recipes, early access to video, booking for my tasting menu, and quite a lot more content from me. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.